The air in the Redemption Saloon was a thick, foul soup of stale whiskey, sweat, and despair. For Ilara, it was the smell of her own commodification. She stood by the wall, a ghost in a worn calico dress, her hands resting protectively over the slight swell of her belly, the secret she had guarded so fiercely now feeling as conspicuous as a brand. The man who had brought her west, a portly merchant named Bartholomew with damp hands and a crueler smile, had lost his stake. And she, it turned out, had been the final bet. Her mail-order contract, the paper that bound her life to his, now lay on the greasy table beside a pile of worn chips and a few silver dollars. She did not look at the men. She couldn't bear their gazes, which felt like physical hands pouring at her, stripping away the last tattered remnants of her dignity. Instead, she fixed her eyes on a knot in the warped floorboards, tracing its whirls as if it were a map out of this suffocating room. The boisterous laughter and backslapping that followed Bartholomew's final, desperate gamble had faded into a tense, expectant silence. A new transaction was taking place. A different kind of ownership? Well, Silas, Bartholomew's voice was a ragged snarl, thick with impotent fury. She's yours. A bit used, as you can see, but still serviceable, he gestured dismissively toward her belly, and a wave of nausea so profound washed over Ilara she had to lock her knees to keep from collapsing. She forced herself to look up then, to see the man who had won her. He sat opposite Bartholomew, a silhouette against the grimy window. He hadn't spoken a word during the final, tense hands of the poker game, his face an unreadable mask of stone and shadow. He was not like the others. Where they were loud and fleshy, he was spare and quiet, all hard lines and coiled stillness. His hat was low, but she could see the sharp cut of his jaw and a beard that was more stubble than flourish. He pushed himself back from the table, the scrape of his chair leg a screech against the floorboards and her nerves. He was tall, broader in the shoulder than she'd realized. He took the contract, folded it once, and tucked it into the inner pocket of his worn canvas coat. His eyes, when they finally met hers, were not leering or triumphant. They were a flat, dispassionate grey, like a winter sky, and they held her gaze for a moment that stretched into an eternity. In them, she saw nothing. No pity, no cruelty, no kindness. And that absolute emptiness was more terrifying than any overt threat. He had not won a woman, he had acquired an asset, and she could not begin to guess its purpose. He turned his gaze back to Bartholomew. "The debt is settled," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It was the first time she had heard it. Then, his unsettling grey eyes returned to her. Come, it was not a request. The walk from the saloon to the preacher's small, clapboard house was a walk through a waking nightmare. The setting sun cast long, distorted shadows that clawed at the dusty street, and the eyes of the town followed her. She felt their judgment like a physical weight, the whispers slithering behind her. A pregnant bride, won in a poker game, being marched to a sham of a wedding by a man who was himself an outcast. She knew of Silas. Not his name, perhaps, until tonight, but his presence. The solitary man who kept a homestead miles out in the barren scrubland, who came to town for supplies only when necessary and spoke to no one. A man whispered about, feared for his silence and his self-sufficiency. And now he was her husband. The preacher was a thin, severe man with a Bible clutched in his bony hands as if it were a weapon. He looked from Silas's impassive face to Ilara's bowed head, his lips a thin line of disapproval. "This is irregular, Silas," he said, his voice dripping with sanctimony. "She needs a name." "The child needs a name," Silas stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. It was a statement of fact, a logistical detail, as if he were discussing fencing or livestock. The ceremony was a hollow, brittle thing. Ilara's responses were whispers, lost in the cavernous silence of the small room. She felt the cold weight of the simple iron ring Silas slid onto her finger. It felt less like a symbol of union and more like a manacle. She did not look at him. She couldn't. To look at him would be to acknowledge the full, crushing reality of her situation. She was bound, legally and irrevocably, to a complete stranger who had claimed her as spoils. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, the words held no benediction, only the finality of a prison sentence. Silas placed a few coins on the preacher's table, a fee for services rendered, and then turned to her. He did not offer his arm. He simply nodded toward the door. The ride to his homestead began in the deep purple of twilight, the world shrinking to the steady, rhythmic plod of his horse's hooves and the creak of the wagon that carried her and her few meager possessions. She sat huddled in the back, the cold wind whipping loose strands of her hair across her face, each gust a reminder of her utter isolation. She stole glances at his back, a rigid, unyielding line against the darkening horizon. He was a wall of silence, a fortress she could not imagine ever breaching. The landscape grew wilder, the sparse lights of the town disappearing behind them, swallowed by a vast and unforgiving emptiness. The world felt stripped down to its essentials: rock, dust, wind, and the two of them, moving deeper into a shared, unspoken desolation. His homestead was a wound in the vast, desolate landscape. It appeared out of the gloom as the moon climbed higher, a collection of stark, angular shapes against the endless scrub. A small, sturdy-looking cabin, a barn, and a web of rough-hewn fences. It was not a place of comfort or welcome, it was a fortress built for survival, a testament to one man's solitary war against the elements. Silas brought the wagon to a halt and dismounted in one fluid, economical motion. He did not speak, did not offer a hand to help her down. He simply began unhitching the horse, his movements sure and practiced in the pale moonlight. Elara climbed down stiffly, her body aching from the long, jolting ride and the deeper ache of fear. The silence out here was different from the silence in town. It was immense, profound, broken only by the sigh of the wind through the sagebrush and the distant, mournful cry of a coyote. It was a silence that magnified her own smallness, her own insignificance. He lit a lantern inside the cabin, and the warm, flickering light spilled from the single window, a lonely beacon in the overwhelming dark. She hesitated on the threshold, clutching the worn shawl tighter around her shoulders. This was her new home. This cramped, rugged box was to be her world. He beckoned her in with a slight jerk of his head. The interior was as spare and functional as the man himself. A stone hearth dominated one wall, cold and black. A rough plank table with two chairs stood in the center of the single room. Against the far wall was a bed, neatly made, and in the corner nearest the hearth, a small cot had been set up, a thin mattress and a single folded blanket laid upon it. It was clearly for her. A wave of something akin to relief, so sharp it was painful, washed through her. There would be a separation. A boundary. He had not brought her here for that. Not yet, anyway. He gestured toward the cot. "Your place," he said, the two words dropping into the silence like stones in a well. He then moved to the hearth, building a fire with an efficiency that was almost mesmerizing. He worked without wasted motion, his large hands surprisingly deft as he arranged the kindling and logs. Soon, a small, hungry flame flickered to life, pushing back the chill and the shadows. He ladled stew from a pot left warming by the embers into a wooden bowl and set it on the table before her, along with a piece of dark bread. He served himself and sat opposite her, eating without a word. Elara's stomach churned, but she knew she had to eat, for the baby. She forced herself to lift the spoon, the simple, nourishing food a stark contrast to the turmoil inside her. They ate in absolute silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the scrape of their spoons against wood. He finished first, rose, and took his bowl to a wash basin. Then, without another look at her, he took a blanket from his own bed and went outside. She heard the barn door slide shut. He was sleeping there. He was giving her the cabin, the fire. This small, unexpected act of decency was a crack in the monolithic terror she had felt. It was not kindness, she told herself. It was practicality. But as she curled onto the narrow cot, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin, the warmth from the hearth felt like a fragile promise in the vast, cold darkness of her new life. The days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons, a silent, shared choreography of survival. Silas would rise before the first hint of dawn, his movements quiet but purposeful as he stoked the fire before heading out to the barn. Ilara would wake to the warmth he left behind, the cabin feeling less like a prison in the soft morning light. Her life became a circle of small, necessary tasks. She tended the fire, cooked their meals from his stores of dried beans, salted meat, and flour, and kept the small cabin as clean as she could. She mended his torn shirts, her needle moving with a steady, practiced rhythm that soothed the frantic beating of her own heart. He, in turn, worked his land with a relentless, punishing energy. From sunup to sundown, he was a distant figure in the fields, breaking soil, clearing rock, mending fences. He was a force of nature in his own right, battling the unforgiving earth into submission. They rarely spoke. Words seemed superfluous, an intrusion on the vast, speaking silence of the plains. Their communication was a language of actions. When the water barrel was low, he would refill it without being asked. When she left a plate of food on the table for him at midday, he would eat it and leave the clean plate by the wash basin. It was a strange, sterile kind of partnership, built on necessity and proximity, yet it was a partnership nonetheless. She watched him constantly, from the cabin window or the porch. She studied the way he moved, the set of his shoulders, the way he could stand for long minutes staring out at the horizon, as still and silent as the rocks around him. She searched for clues to the man inside the hardened shell, for any sign of the thoughts that moved behind those impenetrable grey eyes. She found little. He was a closed book, written in a language she did not understand. One afternoon, while sweeping the floor, her broom dislodged a small object from beneath the edge of his bed. It was a bird, crudely carved from a piece of pale wood, its wings half spread as if in mid-flight. The knife marks were rough, but the shape was unmistakable, imbued with a surprising sense of life and grace. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the smooth, worn wood. It was so at odds with the man she thought he was, this hard, practical, unsentimental survivor. Who was this man who, in his solitude, would take the time to carve a bird? She saw no other carvings, no other hint of artistry or softness in the cabin. This small, secret thing felt like a key, though she had no idea what lock it might fit. She gently placed it on the narrow windowsill, where the light would catch it. He never mentioned it, never acknowledged that she had found it or moved it. But she noticed that sometimes, when he came in from the fields, his gaze would rest on it for a fleeting moment before moving on. It became a silent, shared secret between them, a tiny, fragile bridge across the chasm of their silence. The storm came without warning, a bruised purple mass that boiled up over the western horizon, swallowing the afternoon sun in minutes. The wind rose from a sigh to a shriek, tearing at the cabin, and the sky opened, loosing a torrent of rain that hammered against the roof like a frantic drumbeat. Ilara stood at the window, her arms wrapped around herself, watching the world dissolve into a grey, violent blur. The raw power of it terrified her, mirroring the chaos she felt inside. The cabin, which had begun to feel like a sanctuary, now seemed a fragile, flimsy shelter against the rage of the heavens. Silas had been out mending a fence line on the far side of the property. She saw him running back, head down against the gale, his coat plastered to his back. He didn't stop at the cabin but went straight to the barn, his movements urgent as he worked to secure the animals and batten down the doors against the tempest. He came inside drenched and shaking with cold, water streaming from the brim of his hat. He paid her no mind, his attention fixed entirely on the integrity of their shelter. He checked the door latch, wedged a piece of wood against it for extra security, and scanned the ceiling. The wind howled, and the cabin groaned under the assault. A sudden, sharp crack of lightning lit the room in a stark, momentary flash, followed by a clap of thunder so loud the floorboards vibrated beneath her feet. Ilara flinched, a small, involuntary cry escaping her lips. And then it happened. A steady, rhythmic drip began to fall from the ceiling, landing squarely in the middle of her cot. A dark, wet patch began to spread across her blanket. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. It was her space, her only space in this world, and it was being violated. Before she could even think of what to do, Silas was there. He didn't say a word. He simply picked up her mattress in one swift movement and carried it to the other side of the room, setting it down on the floor in the dry, warm space near the hearth. He then took her blanket and pillow and arranged them for her. He placed a bucket under the leak, the methodical plink-plink-plink of the water a new rhythm against the storm's fury. He hung his wet coat by the fire, stripped off his soaked shirt, and sat on the floor with his back against the wall, a silent, bare-chested guardian. He didn't sleep. He sat there all night, keeping watch over the fire, his presence a solid, calming weight in the tumultuous dark. Curled on her makeshift bed, wrapped in the warmth of the hearth, Ilara watched the firelight play over the strong lines of his back and shoulders. For the first time since arriving, she felt not just safe, but protected. The seed of trust, planted by his earlier small decencies, had been watered by the storm. In the heart of the tempest, she finally slept without fear. The gentle curve of her belly grew more pronounced, an undeniable truth in their silent world. With its growth came a new, gnawing anxiety for Ilara. She had no idea how Silas truly felt about the child she carried, a child that was not his, a living reminder of her past and the dishonorable way she had come into his life. He never mentioned it, his gaze sliding past her changing shape as if it were invisible. His silence on the matter was a heavy blanket, and she feared what lay beneath it: resentment, anger, disgust. She imagined the day of the birth, a terrifying ordeal to be faced alone, with this stoic stranger as her only witness. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, a constant companion to the life fluttering within her. One evening, after a long day of him working the south pasture and her washing and mending, he came into the cabin and set something on the table without a word. It was a piece of doeskin, scraped clean and tanned to a buttery softness. It was small, no bigger than one of his hands, but she knew instantly what it was for. It was for the baby. For shoes. It was his first direct acknowledgement of the child's existence, a silent concession, an offering. The gesture was so unexpected, so deeply profound in its quiet simplicity, that it shattered the dam of her composure. She stared at the piece of soft leather, and tears she hadn't even known she was holding back began to well in her eyes and spill down her cheeks. She quickly turned away, embarrassed by her show of emotion, but not before she saw him look at her, a flicker of something unreadable, not pity, but perhaps understanding, in his grey eyes. He turned back to the fire, giving her the space for her tears. The next day, she found her sewing kit and began to work. She cut the soft leather with painstaking care, her stitches small and even. The act of creating something tangible for her baby, of preparing for its arrival in this strange, silent house, began to soothe the ragged edges of her soul. It was an act of hope, of defiance against the despair that had threatened to consume her. Each stitch was a claim on the future, a future that now included not just her and her child, but this quiet, complicated man. She realized he wasn't just tolerating them. He was providing for them. The food, the shelter, the warmth of the fire, and now this small piece of leather that was more valuable to her than gold. He was building a strange, misshapen kind of family around them, not with words or affection, but with the steady, reliable currency of his labor and provision. Her fear began to recede, replaced by a burgeoning, fierce determination. She would not just survive here, she would make a life. She would be strong for her child. And she was beginning to understand that in Silas, she had not found a master, but an unlikely, unwitting ally. The past arrived on a blistering hot afternoon, kicking up dust and malice. Ilara was on the porch, shelling peas into a bowl, when she saw the riders. 3 of them, shimmering in the heat haze. Her blood ran cold. She recognized the portly, slumped figure of Bartholomew in the lead, even from a distance. The 2 men with him were rough-looking drifters she'd seen loafing around the Redemption Saloon. Panic, a familiar, sickening serpent, coiled in her gut. She stood quickly, the bowl of peas clattering to the floorboards, and backed toward the cabin door. Silas was in the barn, sharpening an axe blade. The rhythmic, metallic rasp of the whetstone stopped. He had heard them, too. Bartholomew reined in his horse a few yards from the cabin, his face flushed and bloated, his eyes slick with whiskey and resentment. "Silas," he bellowed, his voice thick and ugly. "Come on out." "I've come to discuss our mutual property." He spat the last word, his eyes lingering on Ilara with a proprietary sneer that made her skin crawl. The cabin door opened and Silas stepped out, wiping his hands on a rag. He moved without haste, planting himself between Ilara and the riders. He was unarmed, his posture relaxed, but there was a tension in his stillness, a lethal calm that was more intimidating than any overt display of aggression. "There's nothing to discuss, Bartholomew," Silas said, his voice flat. "You lost. The debt is paid." "Did I?" Bartholomew sneered, leaning on his saddle horn. "I think I was cheated. And I've come to collect what's mine," he nodded toward Ilara. The contract was for a bride, not for you to play homesteader with. I'll take her back." Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. To go back with that man was a fate worse than death. She looked at Silas's back, a solid wall of canvas and muscle. It was all that stood between her and a return to the nightmare. "She's not property," Silas said, his voice dangerously low. He took a half-step forward. "She's my wife." The words hung in the hot, still air, stunning Ilara with their force and finality. My wife. He had never called her that. He had never claimed her so possessively, so absolutely. Bartholomew let out a harsh, barking laugh. "Wife? You think that sham of a ceremony with that prattling preacher means anything? You won her in a card game, Silas. Let's not pretend this is anything other than what it is." He started to dismount, his intentions clear and ugly. "Now, give her over, or my friends and I will take her. And we'll take whatever else we find here, too." The two drifters beside him shifted, their hands moving toward the pistols on their hips. The air grew thick with the promise of violence. The confrontation exploded with the brutal swiftness of a lightning strike. Bartholomew had barely gotten 1 foot out of the stirrup when Silas moved. He was not a brawler, he did not trade clumsy, angry blows. His violence was a thing of cold, terrifying efficiency, born of a life that tolerated no weakness. He closed the distance in 2 long strides, his fist connecting with Bartholomew's jaw in a sickening crunch of bone. The portly man crumpled, unconscious before he even hit the ground. Before the other two could react, Silas had spun, grabbing the wrist of the man reaching for his pistol. He twisted, using the man's own momentum against him, and there was a sharp, clean snap. The man screamed, clutching his broken arm, his gun falling into the dust. The third man, momentarily stunned, finally managed to draw his weapon. He raised it, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and bravado. Ilara stifled a scream, her hands flying to her mouth. Silas did not hesitate. He lunged forward, not at the man, but at the gun, his body low. He slammed his shoulder into the man's chest, driving him backward. The gun went off, the shot deafeningly loud, kicking up dirt harmlessly to the side. Silas drove the man to the ground, his forearm pressing against the man's throat until he dropped the pistol. He did not kill him. He did not need to. He had disarmed and disabled them with a kind of primal, predatory grace that was both horrifying and magnificent to behold. He stood over the 2 conscious men, his chest heaving slightly, his grey eyes burning with a cold fire Ilara had never seen. "Get him," Silas rasped, nodding toward the unconscious Bartholomew. "And get off my land. If you ever come back, I will bury you where you stand." Scrambling in the dust, their bravado shattered, the 2 men hauled their groaning employer onto his horse and fled, leaving a cloud of shame and dust in their wake. Silas stood watching them go, a solitary, immovable figure guarding the world he had built. When the riders were nothing more than a smudge on the horizon, Silas finally turned. The cold fire in his eyes had dimmed, leaving only a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. Ilara saw then that his sleeve was dark with blood. During the scuffle, a knife she hadn't even seen had sliced his forearm, a long, ragged gash from wrist to elbow. The adrenaline that had held him upright began to fade, and he swayed, bracing a hand against the cabin wall. The sight of his blood, his vulnerability, broke the spell of her fear. A fierce, primal instinct rose up in her, a need to protect the man who had just protected her so completely. She rushed inside, her hands no longer trembling with fear but steady with purpose. She grabbed the tin basin, filled it with clean water, and found the strips of linen she used for bandages. When she came back out, he was sitting on the porch steps, his head bowed. She knelt before him without a word, taking his injured arm gently in her hands. It was the first time they had truly touched, skin to skin, with intention and care. His muscles were corded with tension, but he did not pull away. He allowed her to minister to him, his gaze fixed on her face as she carefully washed the dirt and blood from the wound. Her touch was deft and sure. She worked in silence, her focus absolute. The world shrank to this single, intimate act, her hands on his arm, the clean scent of water, the shared air between them. When the wound was clean, she wrapped it tightly with the linen, her movements economical and practiced. He watched her, his expression unreadable but intense, as if he were seeing her for the first time, not as a burden or a prize, but as a woman of quiet strength and capability. When she finished, she tied off the bandage and her hands lingered for a moment on his arm. She looked up, and their eyes met. The chasm of silence that had defined their existence was bridged in that single, profound look. There were no words, but none were needed. In his eyes, she saw gratitude, respect, and a flicker of something deeper, something protective and raw. In her own, he saw not a victim, but a partner. An equal. He had fought for her. And she, in turn, was caring for him. That night, he did not return to the barn. He brought his own bedroll in from the barn and laid it on the floor near the hearth, a few feet from her cot. The cabin no longer felt like his space that she was merely allowed to occupy. It felt like theirs. A shared shelter, defended and now sanctified by their shared ordeal. In the weeks that followed, a quiet transformation settled over the homestead. The violent confrontation had acted like a purifying fire, burning away the last vestiges of fear and uncertainty, leaving behind a foundation of hard-won trust. The silence between them was different now. It was no longer an empty void but a comfortable space, filled with unspoken understanding. Their shared life fell into a new, easier rhythm. He still worked the land with his relentless energy, but now, when he came in from the fields, his eyes would seek her out first. She, in turn, found herself watching for his return, a small knot of warmth tightening in her chest when she saw his familiar silhouette cresting the hill. The cabin, once a symbol of her confinement, had become a haven. Her body grew heavy with the final stages of pregnancy, and with it, her spirit grew lighter. The terror of her past, of Bartholomew, of the leering men in the saloon, had been cauterized by Silas's quiet, brutal defense of her. She was no longer the frightened, abandoned girl who had been traded like chattel. She was Ilara, a woman on the cusp of motherhood, a woman who had found a strange and unexpected strength within herself and an even stranger strength in the man beside her. One cool morning, as the first hints of spring began to soften the hard edges of the land, he came in from an early walk along the creek bed. He said nothing, but he left a single, perfect wildflower on the table beside her sewing basket. It was a tiny purple blossom, fragile and resilient, a splash of impossible color in a world of brown and gray. The gesture was so simple, so profound, it made her heart ache with a gentle, unfamiliar joy. She picked it up, its delicate scent a promise of renewal, and placed it in a cup of water, a centerpiece for their silent home. Later that day, she stood on the porch, one hand resting on the swell of her belly, feeling the strong, insistent kick of the life within. She watched Silas out in the field, turning the dark earth in preparation for spring planting. He worked with the same steady, powerful rhythm as always, a part of the landscape itself. But he was no longer a stranger to her, no longer a figure of fear. He was the man who had given her and her child a name when they had none. He was the man who had defended their home. He was the man who brought her wildflowers. As if sensing her gaze, he stopped his work and straightened, turning to look back at the cabin. His eyes met hers across the distance, a long, steady gaze that held no questions and needed no answers. It held the quiet promise of shared sunrises, of a fire in the hearth against the winter cold, of a future to be built together. The world was still a harsh and unforgiving place, but she no longer faced it alone. A small, genuine smile touched Ilara's lips. She was home.